Joseph Moore climbed a set of rain-slicked steps carved into the face of a cliff on one of the most isolated rocks in the North Atlantic. Sent ahead from the supply ship Hesperus to find out why no one on Alanmore had answered the ship's horn, why no flag hung from the pole, why no figure had appeared on the landing, why the lighthouse that was supposed to guide vessels through some of the deadliest waters in Europe had been dark for 11 days. Kitchen door, the one that opened into the living quarters where 3 men were supposed to be on duty, was standing open. He stepped
God's
inside.
sake, it's freezing in here.
The fireplace was cold, the ash pale and undisturbed for what appeared to be days. The smell of damp stone and stale air filled a space that should have carried the warmth of a working station. He moved through the rooms in succession. Every bed was empty, left as you'd expect from men who had risen on a normal morning and simply never returned. The clocks had stopped. The lamp in the tower above was cleaned, the oil reservoir full. The rotating mechanism properly maintained, everything in perfect order, as if the keepers had finished their last shift, walked out the front door, and dissolved into the Atlantic. 3 men had been stationed on this island. James Ducat, 43 years old, principal keeper. 20 years of experience guarding lights in some of the harshest postings Scotland could offer. A wife and 4 children waiting at the shore station on the Isle of Lewis. Thomas Marshall, 28, the youngest. Second assistant keeper, single, meticulous in his log keeping. And Donald MacArthur, 40, an occasional keeper brought in to cover for William Ross, who was recovering on sick leave. Some accounts say from illness. Others say from an accident on the supply trolley that broke his arm when the brakes failed on the Cliff Railway. All 3 men were gone. But here's the detail that has kept this case alive for over a century. The single observation that turns a disappearance into something far more disturbing when Moore inventoried the coats hanging by the door. He found that Marshall's oilskin was gone, Ducat's waterproof was gone. But MacArthur's coat, the only coat he was ever known to wear, was still hanging on its hook. Scottish December, on an exposed rock hammered by wind and spray from the North Atlantic, a man had walked outside in nothing but his shirt sleeves. That is not the behavior of someone following protocol. That is the behavior of a man in desperate urgency, or a man whose mind had already started to break. No bodies, no blood, no farewell, no sign of violence, no wreckage. Just 3 empty beds, a cold fireplace, a stopped clock, and a lighthouse that had gone silent while the ocean kept its secret. If you've been following this channel's investigations, the frozen carnage of Dyatlov Pass, the last 90 seconds inside the cockpit of MH370, you know that isolation doesn't merely separate people from civilization. It changes what they become. But every case we've dissected had something to work with. A black box, footprints in the snow, radiation on the tent. Moore gave us nothing but absence. 3 men, a locked lighthouse, and a question that the North Atlantic has refused to answer for 125 years. To understand how 3 people can vanish from a place where vanishing shouldn't be physically possible, you first need to understand what the Flannan Isles are, and what they do to the human mind over 6 consecutive weeks. Locally as Flannan, the 7 hunters are a scattered group of barren, uninhabited rocks jutting out of the Atlantic roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. The largest island, Moore, is barely 38 acres of wind-scoured grass clinging to the summit of a 200-foot cliff that drops straight into black, churning water. There is no harbor. There is no natural shelter. The wind does not pause. The North Atlantic drives waves against these rocks with a violence that has been precisely measured. In the 1950s, a lighthouse keeper stationed on Moore nearly died trying to photograph a wave that splashed 300 feet up the cliff face, wetting the land at the very top of the tower, 300 feet. That is not a metaphor. That is documented hydrology. The sea around the 7 hunters does not follow the rules you learned on collar coasts. For centuries before the lighthouse existed, these islands carried a reputation that kept anyone with sense away after sunset. Local shepherds from the Isle of Lewis would sail their flocks to Eilean to graze. The island's grass was believed to hold healing properties, producing twin lambs and restoring sick ewes to health, but no shepherd stayed overnight. The legends spoke of spirits that patrolled the island after dark, ancient guardians who punished trespassers. There were ruins on Eilean Mobathes, small stone huts, and the crumbling chapel of St. Flannan, the island's namesake. But they were relics of a time when someone had tried to live here and failed. The surrounding waters carried their own mythology, the blue men of the Minch, green-haired storm kelpies who lived in underwater caves and sank ships by dragging sailors into rhyming duels beneath the waves. You lost the last word. You lost your life. The fishermen of the Outer Hebrides did not treat these stories as campfire entertainment. They navigated by them. In 1895, the Northern Lighthouse Board decided that the shipping lanes around the Seven Hunters had swallowed enough vessels. Construction of a lighthouse on Eilean began, and it was brutal. Workers had to blast to landing platforms into the base of the cliff, east and west, to accommodate different wind directions, because there were days when the Atlantic would only let you approach from one side. They cut zigzag staircases into the rock, built a cable-powered railway to haul materials to the summit, and erected a 75-foot stone tower at the highest point of the island. The light itself was powered by oil lamps magnified through a set of Fresnel lenses floating in a trough of liquid mercury. When dirty, the mercury had to be strained through cloth by hand. No gloves, no protection, no understanding in 1900 that the metal seeping into the keeper's skin could produce tremors, paranoia, hallucinations, and violent emotional instability over months of exposure. The phrase "mad as a hatter" was born from mercury poisoning. Keep that in the back of your mind. It matters later. On December 7th, 1899, the Eilean lighthouse was lit for the first time. For keepers were assigned to the station, rotating in staggered shifts. 6 weeks on the island, 2 weeks off. So that 3 men were always on duty while the 4th rested at the shore station on Lewis. night shifts. They wound the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lenses every 60 minutes. Without fail, while the wind screamed against the tower walls with a sound that veterans described as something between a freight train and a sustained human scream. During the day, they cleaned optics, maintained the tower, logged atmospheric readings, and recorded every event with the precision of men who knew that their logs were the only proof they existed. Each lighthouse had a unique flash pattern, a different rotation speed that allowed lost sailors to identify their position. The keepers weren't just maintaining a lamp. They were maintaining a signature, a fingerprint of light that ships depended on to not die. The primary directive was absolute. Under no circumstances, for no reason, do you ever let the light go out. Everything else, maintenance, meals, sleep, your own survival, was secondary. The isolation between supply runs could stretch from the scheduled 2 weeks, 2 months if storms prevented the ship from crossing. There was no radio, no telephone, no way to contact the mainland except signal poles visible from shore if anyone was watching. The only company the keepers had was each other, the seabirds, and a pet canary that lived inside the station. That canary would become the strangest footnote in the entire investigation. Now the timeline breaks. On December 15th, 1900, the steamship Archer passed within sight of Aylen Wool. Captain Hallman noted in his own log that the lighthouse was dark. Conditions were clear. The light should have been visible for 24 nautical miles. When the Archer docked, the crew reported the outage. And then, in a chain of bureaucratic failure that echoes the communication collapse we documented in the MH370 investigation, this report was never forwarded to the Northern Lighthouse Board. One organization with the resources and authority to investigate was never told. 18 miles southeast, on Gallon Head, a gamekeeper named Roderick Mackenzie held the single most important civilian post in this entire system. He was paid £8 a year for one job. Look at the lighthouse every night, and if the light is out, telegraph Edinburgh immediately. Mackenzie later told investigators that he had been unable to see the light for 2 full weeks. He admitted he'd been concerned, but he never sent the telegram. Never picked up a pen, never spoke to anyone. His entire function in the chain, the only reason he was being paid, was to raise an alarm that he never raised. Principal Keeper Ducat had, months earlier, requested an experiment to test how quickly someone onshore would notice a distress signal and respond. The NLB denied the request. Ducat got his answer anyway. The answer was not fast enough, not nearly fast enough. On December 26th, the Hesperus finally arrived, delayed 11 days by storms that had made the crossing impossible. Moore went ashore. He found everything I've already described. But the next morning, when the relief crew explored the western side of the island, they found something else entirely. The iron railings along the path to the west landing were bent and ripped from their concrete foundations. The storage box that had held mooring ropes and tackle was gone, obliterated. Its contents were strewn across the rocks below like debris from an explosion. And 110 feet above sea level, a life buoy that had been secured among the railings was missing. The ropes that held it had not been untied or unfastened by human hands. They had been torn, sheared, by something with enough force to rip braided rope from iron fittings at a height where no wave should exist. Except that on Aylan, waves do exist at that height and higher. But here's the complication that the official report glosses over. When Moore checked the keeper's log, the damage to the west landing had already been recorded. It predated whatever happened to the 3 men. The damage was old news. The mystery was in the entries themselves. The last formal log entry was dated December 13th. A slate, a rough working surface used for temporary notes before they were copied into the permanent book, had entries through December 15th, including the time the light was extinguished that morning and atmospheric readings taken at 9 a.m. The data was routine, mundane. But the log also described something that could not have been there. Severe storms and violent winds on the island during a period when not a single vessel in the surrounding waters, not one, reported any storm activity. Either the weather on Aylan was so extraordinarily localized that it raged exclusively over 38 acres of rock without touching shipping lanes. Just miles away, the 3 men were writing about storms that did not exist. Then there are the disputed entries attributed to Thomas Marshall, the youngest keeper, the lowest-ranking man on the station. Found at a later date, these entries describe the storms as so overwhelming that all 3 men dropped to their knees and prayed. Marshall wrote that Ducat had been very quiet in recent days. He wrote that MacArthur, the occasional keeper, the man with the documented rough temperament, had been seen crying. Professional lighthouse historians have cast doubt on these logs, noting that Marshall, as the junior keeper, would never have recorded observations about his superior's emotional states in an official document. But the final entry, whether Marshall wrote it or someone else did, consists of 5 words that have become the most haunting sentence in maritime investigation. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. Someone wrote those words. And then no one wrote anything ever again. So what happened? Before we examine the theories, there's one detail that often gets buried in retellings of this case, but that investigators noted at the time. The keeper's pet canary was still alive inside the station, in good condition. The bird had food and water. Whatever happened to the 3 men, it happened suddenly, but not so chaotically that no one had fed the canary. Someone had been alive and functioning in that lighthouse recently enough for the bird to survive. That narrows the window, and it makes the silence of the station even more unsettling. The Northern Lighthouse Board's official conclusion, supported by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, who had personally recruited all 3 missing keepers, is the simplest theory available. The men went to the West Landing to secure equipment in rough weather. Marshall had been fined 5 shillings once before for losing gear in a storm, a significant financial penalty that could have motivated him to take a risk.
Here, look at the railing.
2 men went down.
Head for the shelter,
A wave
quickly.
caught one. The second tried to help. MacArthur saw it from above and ran out in his shirt sleeves because there was no time to grab a coat. All 3 were swept into the sea. It's clean. It's logical. And it has fractures that have never healed. No bodies ever washed ashore. Not on the 7 hunters, not on Lewis, not on any coast within the drift pattern. The wind on December 15th was documented as blowing west to east, meaning it would have pushed the men back toward the island, not out to sea. And every professional lighthouse keeper who has reviewed this case raises the same fundamental objection. No trained keeper would abandon the light. Not for a colleague in the water. Not for a friend drowning 10 feet away. The light was the mission. Everything, including survival, was secondary. These were men with decades of combined experience. The idea that all 3 would violate the one rule they were trained to never break requires a kind of panic that contradicts everything in their service records. Unless panic is exactly what it was, the Mercury theory remains. MacArthur's documented history of violent behavior, combined with months of unprotected mercury exposure in a sealed tower, could produce precisely the emotional collapse that Marshall's disputed logs describe. Could one man have attacked the others? Could a psychotic break have sent all three into the ocean in different ways, at different moments, for different reasons? There is no blood evidence, no damage to the interior, no sign of struggle, but the Atlantic is patient. And a body dropped from 200 feet into that water would vanish as thoroughly as the three men themselves. Folklore theories, the blue men, the three black birds that Joseph Moore reportedly saw perched atop the lighthouse as he approached. Birds that flew away as if releasing three imprisoned souls. These belong to a different category of explanation. But for the men who kept the light on Aylen Moore for the 70 years that followed, those stories were not academic. Multiple lighthouse keepers stationed on the island after 1900 reported the same experience. Voices carrying on the wind, clearly and distinctly calling out the names Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, as if someone were standing just behind them on the cliff edge. On an island where isolation already bends perception, the memory of three vanished men became its own kind of presence, a haunting. That did not require ghosts to function because the absence of explanation was haunting enough. On September 28, 1971, the Aylen Moore Lighthouse was automated. The last human keepers descended the cliff stairs for the final time. And the light has burned without human hands ever since. A concrete helipad was built for the maintenance crews who visit periodically. And the sound of rotors has replaced the footsteps on the spiral staircase. The tower still stands. The cliffs still drop 200 feet into water that has never once been calm. Robert Muirhead's official report closes with a line that is either the most honest or the most helpless sentence in lighthouse history. I am of opinion that the men had been on duty at the island and had been swept away. That is the answer. It has never been sufficient. 3 men. Ducat, the 20-year veteran who warned the board about communication failures. Marshall, the young man whose last recorded words were about God. And MacArthur, who left his only coat behind because whatever was happening outside that door was worse than a December gale on bare skin. These 3 men stepped past the boundary of what evidence can verify, and the ocean consumed the rest. No wreckage. No remains. No theory that survives every fact. Just a lighthouse that went dark for 11 days, and an island that has never spoken about what it saw. The light on Eilean Moor still flashes every 30 seconds, visible from 24 nautical miles.